Hey guys, my name is Amy Jane and welcome back to my channel. Does research show that low-carb diets are dangerous? I'm a registered dietitian and in today's video I'm going to discuss a popular recent study published by the Lancet claiming that low-carb diets might cause an early death. And that can be pretty scary, right? But let's walk through it and discuss what makes this particular study weak and why it's important to look at every study with a critical eye. I've listed timestamps of the key points as well as the conclusion in the description box below if you'd like to jump to somewhere specific. Just to be clear, the purpose of this video is not to promote or advise against a certain type of diet. I simply wanted to talk about nutrition research, especially one study that I feel was done poorly but got a lot of press. To summarize, this study looked at about 15,000 adults aged 45 to 62 years old in 4 different US communities starting back in 1987. And these people completed a dietary questionnaire, and the researchers investigated the association between the percentage of energy from carbohydrate intake and all-cause mortality. After a 25-year follow-up, they concluded that both groups of people eating a low-carb diet, defined as less than 40% of calories from carbohydrate, and a high-carb diet, defined as more than 70% of calories from carbohydrate, had a higher risk of mortality than those who ate between 50 and 55% of calories from carbohydrate. So in other words, eating what they define as low carb and high carb will increase your risk of death, while eating what they define as moderate carb will decrease your risk of death or show minimal risk. I'm not going to cover everything, but here are the major issues. The first major issue is the classification of low carbohydrate. What this study considers low carbohydrate is 40% or less of calories from carbs. So for an average person eating 2,000 calories a day, this is equivalent to 800 calories or 200 grams of carbohydrate. And when the public hears low carb, they typically assume a ketogenic low carb type of diet, which is usually only 20 to 50 grams for an average person or upwards of 75 to 100 grams for a high performance athlete. The ketogenic community wouldn't consider a diet consisting of 200 grams to be low carb simply because that would not result in ketosis. So in other words, this study did not research the effects of a truly low carb diet as defined by a ketogenic diet, which is what I believe the researchers were getting at when they mentioned studying current popular low carb diets which restrict carbohydrate. The next issue is a big one, and that is the way in which the data was collected. Participants in the study completed a food frequency questionnaire every 2 to 3 years. And this survey had 66 questions and was completed a total of 6 times over 25 years. A food frequency questionnaire attempts to collect how often a person consumes a particular food group. So for example, how many times a month do you eat vegetables? This type of data collection has been scrutinized even in the dietetic community for a couple reasons. One, it relies on memory. Do you remember what you had for lunch last week? Or 6 months ago? Or 2 years ago? Not only is memory a problem, but also false reporting. How likely is someone to report that donut or can of soda to the nutrition researchers studying your diet? That can be pretty intimidating and easy to sugarcoat the truth and portray a better version than the actual diet. It also assumes that the participant's diet has stayed consistent since the previous questionnaire 2 or 3 years ago. And I don't know about you, but my diet varies day to day. You know, sometimes I'm eating peanut butter every day for a month and the next I'm on to something else. It changes all the time and surely isn't consistent day to day, let alone year to year. Another problem with the survey is the necessity to estimate the amount of food eaten. So for example, the questionnaire will ask something like, how many cups of pasta or how many ounces of chicken did you consume at one meal? And the study provided some models and photos of food to use for reference, but guessing how many cups or ounces of a food that you ate 2 years ago or just in general can be really difficult and inaccurate. The next issue is the type of carbohydrate. This study never mentions what type of carbohydrates the participants are eating. So we don't know if they were eating fruits, vegetable, rice, soda, pasta, or Cheetos, and all of those would fall into the category of carbohydrate. Eating 200 grams of carbs, mainly from vegetables and rice, is going to affect a person's health much differently than eating 200 grams of mostly soda, candy, and chips, right? But unfortunately, this study doesn't differentiate, which leaves us in the dark about the potential side effects of the complex category of carbohydrate. We also don't have a clear picture on what the rest of the diet composition looked like. How much protein and fat did these participants consume? What was the source and quality of these macronutrients? These will also play a key part in the outcome of the study, so without them, the puzzle is incomplete. It's also worth mentioning that the study states participants who consumed a relatively low percentage of total energy from carbohydrate were more likely to be young, male, a self-reported race other than Black, college graduates, have a high body mass index, exercise less during leisure time, have high household incomes, smoke cigarettes, and have diabetes. So this statement shows us that there are definite factors playing into the health of the group categorized as low carb. Yet in the discussion section of the study, it states that the group of people categorized as low carb are at an increased risk of dying early, alluding to the fact that it's because of their carbohydrate intake, while never mentioning the many other issues that could also increase the risk of mortality, mainly a high BMI, so being overweight, smoking, and diabetes. And one should look at this statement and consider everything holistically. What did cause this group to die earlier than the rest? Was it the amount of carbs that they ate, or fat or protein? Was it being overweight? Was it smoking cigarettes? Was it uncontrolled blood sugar and diabetes? Was it something we haven't considered yet? Or was it a combination of these factors that ultimately increased mortality? I was just surprised that with multiple cofactors and so little evidence or concrete data, which I'll expand on in a minute, that the conclusion of increased mortality was pinned on any one thing, and in this case, amount of carbohydrate. Another issue was the type of study. This was an observational study, meaning that researchers let people live their lives as they normally would without external influence, and then observed or checked in every 2 to 3 years with a questionnaire. And in contrast, within the science community, an experimental study is the gold standard and is the strongest type of study able to correlate cause and effect. In an experimental study, the researcher influences aspects of the study to narrow down and minimize factors affecting the results. In this type of study, there would be the participants would be randomized, and there would also be a control group not under the influence of the researchers to compare to. So for example, to research the effects of a low-carb diet in an experimental study, the researchers would control the exact amount of carbs that the participants eat each day and compare that to a control group eating any amount of carbs that they wish. It doesn't rely on memory, and it's precise in this type of clinical setting. The researchers would be involved every step of the way, ensuring the correct amount of carbohydrate in the diet. But unfortunately, observational studies do lack these important qualities. So why even do an observational study then, right? Well, clinically controlled experimental studies in any field, including nutrition, are expensive and very difficult to conduct because you have to find participants who are willing to let a researcher control what they eat day in and day out, which is why the much less expensive and inferior option of an observational study is typically done. But there are good quality experimental studies out there on diet, and more coming out every month, so definitely keep your eyes peeled for those. The last point I'll make is the lack of mortality data. This study never once tells us how many people died in each of the 3 carbohydrate categories, let alone what they died from, which is just really confusing. Instead, they list the total amount deceased and state that the primary outcome was all-cause mortality, meaning that they counted death from any cause. So car accidents and other causes completely unrelated to carbohydrate intake or diet were counted in their total death count. And this lack of evidence is truly concerning, especially in such a prestigious journal like the Lancet. Scientific studies such as this one are what have and will continue to shape our national nutrition guidelines. So what we do with this information is really important. Registered dietitians, or RDs, are responsible for staying up to date with the research and passing it along to the public. We as RDs need to know how to tell the difference between a quality study and a weak one. We need to be staying current and read studies with findings that both agree and disagree with our current beliefs or personal biases about what's healthy and what's not healthy. We need to read more than just the abstract and results section of research so that we can understand the full picture, because our recommendations are what's going to be affecting people's lives. This shows us that while it's true that we shouldn't blindly follow the next trendy diet we hear about, We also shouldn't blindly believe the next shocking research headline either. I also want to point out that the Lancet posted a study just a year ago in August 2017, and here's some of the highlights. We found that high carbohydrate intake, more than 60% of energy, was associated with an adverse impact on total mortality. By contrast, higher fat intake was associated with lower risk mortality, non-cardiovascular disease mortality, and stroke. Our findings do not support the current recommendations to limit total fat intake to less than 30% of energy and saturated fat intake to less than 10% of energy. Individuals with high carbohydrate intake might benefit from a reduction in carbohydrate intake and increase in the consumption of fat. Now, these two studies were both posted by the Lancet, but only one got attention and a media spotlight. One says that high carb, low fat is dangerous. The other says low carb, high fat is dangerous. And the point is that there will always be contradictory research, so we need to be on our toes and investigate all of it. It's hard to believe that science could ever be flawed, but there is evidence again and again that science, and specifically in the field of nutrition, can contain holes and flaws. I'm going to expand more on this in the future videos, but just remember that scientists once thought that the earth was flat, and even researchers and scientists are still humans just like you and I. So human error and biases are not completely surprising, which is why I like to read every applicable study that I find from top to bottom multiple times. Overall, I don't care if a study is proclaiming high carb or low carb or high fat or low fat or anything in between. My only goal is to follow quality research so that I can implement those findings to improve the longevity and the quality of life for myself and my family, my friends, and my clients. If eating a low-carb ketogenic diet is found to be dangerous through multiple high-quality, clinically controlled trials, I will take that knowledge and pass it on, but this study does not prove that. Friends and family, my piece of advice is to please investigate everything that you read, even science articles, and take everything with a grain of salt. I did link both Lancet studies that I talked about below in the description box and encourage you to read them for yourself if you haven't already. If you enjoyed this type of content and want to see more, then let me know by liking this video and subscribing. And if you have any questions on the subject, then please leave them in the comments below. So, did you happen to see the buzz of this article on social media? Because if you heard about it or read it, I would love to know your thoughts and opinions in the comments section. Thanks for stopping by, and I will see you next time.